The crack of gunfire echoed through Thunder Peak shooting range as Margaret Maggie Walsh stepped through the entrance, her weathered hands clutching a crumpled registration form. At 52, she looked every inch the suburban grandmother in her floral print dress and sensible shoes, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The expensive tactical gear and military-grade equipment surrounding her seemed to mock her presence, like a costume party where she'd forgotten the theme. Behind the bulletproof glass of the observation deck, she could see the elite shooters of the Metropolitan Police Department's SWAT team conducting their monthly qualification tests. Their movements precise and professional as they dominated the advanced ranges. "Ma'am, I think you're lost," sneered the young clerk at the registration desk, barely glancing up from his smartphone. His name tag read Derek, and his dismissive tone suggested he'd already categorized her as another confused civilian who'd wandered into the wrong building. Beginner classes are on Thursdays. This is a restricted training day for law enforcement professionals. Maggie placed her registration form on the counter with quiet determination, her pale blue eyes meeting Derek's with unwavering calm. "I submitted my application for the Precision Excellence Challenge 3 weeks ago. Confirmation number PE 2847. The clerk's smirk faltered as he reluctantly checked his computer, his fingers typing with theatrical exaggeration. There must be some mistake. This competition is invitation, only for certified marksmen with documented competitive experience. We don't run charity events for housewives looking for thrills." From across the lobby, a commanding voice cut through their conversation like a blade. "What seems to be the problem here?" Chief Instructor Victor Callahan emerged from the VIP lounge, his imposing 6'4" frame draped in a custom tactical vest emblazoned with patches from elite military units and law enforcement agencies. His salt-and-pepper beard was meticulously groomed, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold calculation of a predator assessing potential prey. Behind him followed his entourage of devoted students, wealthy civilians who paid premium fees to train alongside real operators and bask in Callahan's reflected glory. "This lady claims she's registered for today's competition, Chief," Derek explained, his voice taking on a reverential tone that bordered on worship. "I told her there must be some error in the system." Callahan's gaze swept over Maggie with practiced disdain, taking in her modest appearance and clearly finding it lacking. "Mrs." he began, his tone suggesting that her name was hardly worth remembering. "Walsh," Maggie replied simply, maintaining her composure despite the obvious intimidation tactics. "Margaret Walsh. I believe my credentials speak for themselves." Callahan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the marble-floored lobby. "Credentials? What credentials could you possibly have? A certificate from a weekend safety course? A ribbon from the county fair shooting gallery?" His followers joined in the laughter, their expensive gear jangling like wind chimes in a storm. Thunder Peak is a serious facility for serious professionals. We train Navy SEALs, FBI tactical teams, and elite police units. This isn't a place for suburban mothers to work CV through their midlife crises. The humiliation was intended to be complete and public, designed to send Maggie scurrying back to whatever quiet suburban life Callahan imagined she'd crawled out of. But instead of retreating, she simply nodded and asked, "What would it take to prove I belong here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired weapon, heavy with implications that no one in the room fully understood yet. Callahan's eyes narrowed, recognizing something dangerous in her calm persistence. "You want to prove yourself? Fine. One shot. Standard target at 100 yards with our house rifle. If you can hit the paper, we'll consider your application. When you miss, you leave quietly and never come back." The crowd that had gathered sensed blood in the water, phones appearing to document what they assumed would be a spectacular failure that would provide entertainment for weeks to come. What none of them knew was that Margaret Walsh had once held a very different name in very different circles. 25 years earlier, as Maggie O'Brien, she had been the youngest woman ever to make the U.S. Olympic shooting team, a prodigy whose unconventional reverse grip technique had revolutionized competitive marksmanship. Her career had ended not due to lack of skill, but because she'd discovered that her coach and several Federation officials were involved in a massive corruption scandal, taking bribes to fix international competitions and manipulate medal standings. When she'd threatened to expose them, they destroyed her career with fabricated drug test results and forged evidence of mental instability. She'd been forced to retreat into anonymity, changing her name and building a quiet life as a small-town librarian, her Olympic medals hidden away in a box that she'd opened only once in the past 2 decades. Thunder Peak Shooting Range wasn't just any firearms facility. It was Victor Callahan's carefully constructed empire of corruption and intimidation. Built with money laundered through shell companies owned by a consortium of dirty cops and military contractors, the range served as both a legitimate business and a front for illegal arms trafficking. Callahan had discovered that wealthy civilians would pay enormous fees to train alongside real operators, feeding their fantasies of tactical competence while providing perfect cover for his criminal enterprises. The monthly law enforcement training sessions were elaborate, theater, designed to maintain his credibility while allowing him to identify potential recruits for his underground network of corrupt officials. The challenge parameters were deliberately designed to humiliate Maggie and reinforce Callahan's dominance over his domain. The house rifle he selected was an aging AR-15 with a scope that had been deliberately miscalibrated, making accurate shooting nearly impossible for anyone unfamiliar with its specific quirks. The 100-yard target seemed reasonable to observers, but Callahan had positioned it in a location where crosswinds from the facility's ventilation system would push shots consistently to the right. It was a rigged game, designed to produce failure and justify his prejudices. "Take your time, Mrs. Walsh," Callahan said with mock courtesy, his voice dripping with condescension. "I understand that some people find the recoil quite startling." The assembled crowd chuckled appreciatively, many of them already composing social media posts about the delusional woman who'd thought she could compete with professionals. Maggie accepted the rifle with steady hands, her muscle memory immediately cataloging its weight, balance, and condition. 25 years might have passed since she'd last held a precision weapon, but her body remembered every detail of the stance, grip, and breathing techniques that had once made her legendary. As she examined the scope, her experienced eye immediately detected the calibration errors that would have sent most shooters' bullets wide of the target. But instead of calling attention to the sabotage, she simply smiled and began her preparation routine. The same series of micro-adjustments and mental focusing techniques that had once carried her to Olympic glory. "Is she seriously going to try the reverse grip?" whispered one of Callahan's students. Recognizing the unconventional hand positioning that Maggie had instinctively adopted, "That's impossible with that rifle configuration. No one shoots reverse grip with an AR platform." But Maggie had always been different. Her smaller hands and unique biomechanics allowing her to achieve stability and control through techniques that would be impossible for larger shooters. As she settled into her stance, something shifted in the atmosphere of the range. The mockery and laughter began to fade as observers recognized the unmistakable signs of a true professional at work. The shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. No dramatic pause, no visible struggle with recoil, just a clean, controlled trigger pull that sent the bullet exactly where Maggie intended it to go. The electronic scoring system immediately displayed the result, a perfect bullseye, dead center, with precision that the facility's equipment could barely measure. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the mechanical whir of the target retrieval system. When the paper target returned, displaying a hole so perfectly centered it looked like it had been created by a precision cutting tool, the crowd erupted in stunned disbelief. Callahan's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: shock, anger, and finally, a cold calculation that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about Margaret Walsh. "Lucky shot," it declared, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "Anyone can get lucky once. Real marksmanship requires consistency under pressure." But even as he spoke, he was mentally reviewing the security camera footage, wondering if he'd somehow been set up by a rival organization or law enforcement sting operation. The woman standing before him was clearly not what she appeared to be. And in Callahan's world of criminal enterprises and hidden agendas, deception was the ultimate threat. "Perhaps we should discuss the terms of the actual competition," Maggie suggested, her quiet voice carrying a new authority that made several people unconsciously step back. "Unless, of course, you're not confident in your own abilities." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of psychological warfare that Callahan usually employed against others. For the first time in years, he found himself on the defensive, facing an opponent whose true capabilities remained completely unknown. Detective Sarah Chen had been conducting surveillance on Thunder Peak for 3 months, part of a joint federal task force investigating reports of illegal weapons trafficking connected to law enforcement personnel. From her position in the parking lot, she'd been documenting the patterns of activity around the facility when she noticed the unusual commotion inside. Through her telephoto lens, she captured the entire sequence of events: the initial confrontation, the rigged shooting challenge, and the impossible shot that had stunned everyone present. But what caught her attention wasn't just the marksmanship display, it was the subtle change in body language among Callahan's inner circle, the way they suddenly began treating the suburban housewife with wary respect. Chen had seen that exact reverse grip technique before, in classified military training videos and Olympic footage from the 1990s. Only one person had ever mastered that particular style of shooting: a young woman who'd vanished from competitive circles under mysterious circumstances decades earlier. If her suspicions were correct, Margaret Walsh wasn't just an unexpected skilled shooter. She was a legend who'd been presumed dead or permanently retired. The implications were staggering, not just for the current investigation, but for the dozens of cold cases involving precision shootings that had never been solved. As the crowd began to disperse, many participants pulling out phones to spread word of what they'd witnessed, Callahan made a strategic decision that would prove to be his undoing. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully and attempting to minimize the incident, his ego and criminal paranoia demanded that he eliminate this threat to his authority. "Mrs. Walsh," he called out as she prepared to leave, "I hope you'll consider joining us for next month's advanced competition. It would be a shame to waste such natural talent." The invitation sounded cordial to casual observers, but Maggie recognized the underlying threat. In accepting his challenge, she'd inadvertently drawn attention to activities that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. That evening, as Maggie drove home to her modest apartment above the public library, where she'd worked for 2 decades, she noticed the black SUV following at a discreet distance. Old habits from her previous life kicked in automatically, and she began employing counter-surveillance techniques that most civilians would never know existed. By the time she reached her destination, she'd confirmed that Thunder Peak's reach extended far beyond the shooting range itself. Callahan wasn't just a corrupt businessman, he was the center of a network that included dirty cops, military contractors, and political figures who would go to great lengths to protect their interests. The break-in at her apartment came 3 days later, professional but not invisible to someone with Maggie's background. They'd been careful not to disturb anything, obviously, but she could tell that her personal papers had been searched and her computer accessed. They were looking for information about her identity, trying to determine if she was an undercover agent or simply an unexpectedly skilled civilian who'd stumbled into their world. What they found instead were decades of carefully constructed lies. False identities layered so deeply that even federal databases showed Margaret Walsh as nothing more than a quiet librarian with no unusual background or connections. The confrontation at the library came on a Thursday morning when two men in expensive suits claimed to be federal agents investigating irregularities in civilian access to law enforcement training facilities. Their credentials looked authentic to untrained eyes. But Maggie immediately recognized them as sophisticated forgeries. "Mrs. Walsh," the older man began, his tone professionally courteous, while his eyes remained cold and calculating. "We understand you recently participated in an unauthorized demonstration at Thunder Peak Shooting Range. We need to discuss the circumstances of that event and your background in firearms handling." The implied threat was clear: cooperate with their investigation or face consequences that went far beyond legal proceedings. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," Maggie replied, maintaining the persona she'd cultivated for over 2 decades. "I'm just a librarian who took a shooting lesson. Surely that's not a federal crime." But even as she spoke, she was analyzing exit routes and assessing the threat level of her unexpected visitors. The younger man's jacket bulged slightly under his left arm, suggesting a shoulder holster, while his partner's right hand never strayed far from his waistband. These weren't federal agents, they were Callahan's enforcers, sent to determine how much she knew and whether she posed a continuing threat to their operations. The situation escalated when Detective Chen arrived at the library. Having traced the connection between Maggie's impressive shooting display and the federal investigation she'd been conducting, her appearance triggered an immediate reaction from the fake agents, who suddenly found themselves caught between a real federal officer and a target whose capabilities they'd significantly underestimated. "Gentlemen," Chen announced, displaying her authentic federal credentials, "I believe you're conducting an unauthorized investigation on federal property. Perhaps you'd like to explain your presence here?" The standoff that followed would determine whether Maggie's carefully constructed new life could survive exposure to the criminal network she'd inadvertently challenged. What Callahan's men didn't realize was that Detective Chen had been building a case against Thunder Peak for months, documenting evidence of illegal weapons trafficking, money laundering, and corruption of public officials. Maggie's appearance at the facility had provided the final piece of the puzzle, demonstrating that Callahan was willing to use intimidation and violence against civilians who threatened his operations. The shooting display itself had been captured on multiple surveillance cameras, providing irrefutable evidence of both Maggie's exceptional skills and Callahan's attempts to publicly humiliate her through sabotaged equipment. As the fake agents attempted to retreat from the library, Chen made the decision that would transform a local investigation into a federal case with international implications. "Mrs. Walsh," she said quietly, "I believe it's time we discussed your real background and how it relates to the criminal organization we've been investigating. Your skills today weren't those of a casual hobbyist, and I think you know exactly what you've stumbled into." The moment of truth had arrived, forcing Maggie to choose between the anonymity she'd carefully maintained for decades and the opportunity to finally confront the corruption that had destroyed her original life. The revelation of Maggie's true identity came slowly, carefully. As she weighed the risks of exposure against the potential for justice, Detective Chen's investigation had uncovered connections between Thunder Peak and the same network of corrupt officials who'd destroyed her Olympic career decades earlier. Victor Callahan wasn't just running a criminal enterprise, he was part of a generational conspiracy that had been destroying lives and subverting institutions for decades. The time had come for Margaret Walsh to become Maggie O'Brien once again, not for personal revenge, but to finally expose the truth that had been buried under layers of corruption and intimidation. The federal task force that assembled over the following weeks included agents from multiple agencies, all working to dismantle a network that had operated with impunity for decades. Maggie's testimony provided crucial insights into how the corruption had evolved since her original exposure attempts in the 1990s. While her unique skills offered opportunities for operations that conventional law enforcement could never have achieved, the final confrontation at Thunder Peak would combine her legendary marksmanship with modern investigative techniques, creating a scenario that Callahan's criminal organization was completely unprepared to handle. The precision excellence challenge that Callahan had proposed became the centerpiece of the federal operation, a public event that would draw all the key players together while providing perfect cover for the arrests that would follow. Maggie's participation wasn't just about proving her skills, it was about demonstrating that ordinary citizens could stand up to institutional corruption and win. The reverse grip bullseye that had started as a moment of personal vindication would become a symbol of justice finally served, proving that truth and skill could triumph over money and influence when supported by courage and determination. As news of the operation spread through law enforcement and shooting communities across the country, Margaret Walsh's story became legend once again. But this time, the legend was complete, encompassing not just her extraordinary abilities, but her moral courage and unwavering commitment to justice. The simple woman who'd been ridiculed at the shooting range had reminded everyone that heroes often come in unexpected packages, and that the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't firepower, it's the willingness to stand up and fight for what's right, no matter the personal cost. The federal task force headquarters buzzed with activity as Agent Rebecca Martinez spread surveillance photos across the conference table, each image revealing another piece of the conspiracy that had taken root within American law enforcement. Thunder Peak isn't just a money laundering operation, she explained to the assembled team, her voice carrying the weight of months of painstaking investigation. It's the epicenter of a network that's been systematically corrupting police departments, military units, and federal agencies for over 30 years. The photos showed meetings between Callahan and high-ranking officials from multiple jurisdictions, cash exchanges in parking lots, and weapon shipments that violated every federal regulation on the books. Detective Chen leaned forward, pointing to a photograph that showed Callahan shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a Washington, D.C. hotel. That's Senator Richard Blackwood, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. If Callahan has compromised someone at that level, this conspiracy goes all the way to the top of our government. The implications were staggering, suggesting that national security decisions were being influenced by criminals who profited from maintaining chaos and conflict rather than pursuing peace and justice. Maggie studied the photographs with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent decades observing patterns and connections that others missed. I recognize some of these faces, she said quietly, her finger tracing across images from different time periods. This man here was involved in the Olympic scandal that ended my career, and this one was part of the military procurement committee that approved contracts for the company that supplied equipment to corrupt police departments. The web of corruption stretched back further than anyone had realized, connecting seemingly unrelated scandals across multiple decades. Agent Martinez pulled up a detailed timeline on the wall-mounted screen, showing how the network had evolved from small-scale sports corruption in the 1990s to the massive criminal enterprise it had become. Your original exposure attempt in 1998 didn't just threaten their Olympic operations, she explained to Maggie. It threatened the entire foundation they were building for future expansion. That's why they worked so hard to destroy your credibility and force you into hiding. The personal nature of Maggie's persecution became clear as the team realized she hadn't just been an inconvenient witness, she'd been a direct threat to billions of dollars in future criminal profits. The planning sessions that followed revealed the true scope of what they were attempting to accomplish. This wasn't just about arresting Victor Callahan or shutting down Thunder Peak. It was about dismantling a network that had metastasized throughout American institutions like a cancer We need to coordinate simultaneous raids across 7 states. Agent Martinez explained, showing a map dotted with red pins indicating known network locations. If we don't move against all of them at once, the survivors will disappear and rebuild somewhere else within months. Detective Chen had discovered that the network's influence extended into the very agencies investigating them, requiring unprecedented security measures to prevent leaks that could compromise the operation. We've identified at least 12 federal agents and 37 local law enforcement officers who've received payments from Callahan's organization, she reported grimly. Some of them are in positions where they could warn the targets or sabotage the raids if they discover our plans. The investigation had become a cat-and-mouse game, where the mice wore badges and carried federal authority. Maggie's role in the upcoming operation went far beyond her legendary marksmanship skills. Her decades of experience observing criminal behavior from her position as a small-town librarian had given her unique insights into how corruption networks operated at the grassroots level. They don't just recruit through money and intimidation. She explained during one strategy session, they identify people who feel overlooked or undervalued by legitimate institutions, then offer them a sense of belonging and importance they can't get anywhere else. It's not just about greed, it's about psychological manipulation on a massive scale. The federal team began to understand that Callahan's shooting range served multiple functions beyond money laundering and weapons trafficking. It was a recruitment center where corrupt officials could identify potential new members, a meeting place where sensitive information could be exchanged without electronic surveillance, and a demonstration facility where the network's capabilities could be showcased to potential clients. Every wealthy civilian who pays for tactical training at Thunder Peak is being evaluated as a potential asset. Agent Martinez realized they're not just customers, they're candidates for corruption or compromise. As the date for the Precision Excellence Challenge approached, the team worked frantically to position surveillance equipment and undercover agents throughout the facility. The public nature of the event provided perfect cover for their operation, but it also meant that hundreds of innocent civilians would be present when the arrests began. We need to ensure that no bystanders are harmed when this goes down, Agent Martinez emphasized during the final briefing. The media attention from this operation will be intense, and we can't afford any mistakes that could discredit the investigation or endanger public safety. Maggie spent the week before the competition reacquainting herself with the technical aspects of precision shooting, her muscle memory returning more quickly than she'd expected. At a secure federal training facility outside the city, she worked with FBI instructors to prepare for scenarios that went far beyond simple marksmanship. Remember, her handler coached, you're not just competing against Callahan's shooters. You're potentially walking into a confrontation with armed criminals who won't hesitate to use violence if they feel cornered. The weight of body armor felt strange after decades of civilian life, but Maggie adapted with the same determination that had once carried her to Olympic glory. The psychological preparation proved more challenging than the physical training. For 25 years, Maggie had deliberately suppressed the competitive fire that had once driven her to excel at the highest levels of international competition. Reawakening that intensity meant confronting memories and emotions she'd buried so deeply that they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I'm not the same person I was back then, she confided to Detective Chen during one of their planning sessions. That young woman was naive enough to believe that truth and justice would automatically triumph over corruption and lies. I know better now. Detective Chen understood the weight of what Maggie was undertaking. You're not trying to become that person again, she replied thoughtfully. You're bringing together everything you've learned in both phases of your life, the skills of the Olympic champion and the wisdom of the librarian who's seen how the world really works. That combination makes you more dangerous to Callahan's network than they could possibly realize. The insight helped Maggie reconcile the different aspects of her identity, understanding that her enforced exile had strengthened rather than weakened her ability to confront corruption. Meanwhile, Victor Callahan was conducting his own preparations. increasingly paranoid about the mysterious woman who demonstrated impossible skills at his facility. His investigation into Margaret Walsh had yielded disturbing inconsistencies that suggested either incredibly sophisticated false identity creation or federal law enforcement involvement. "Sir," reported his chief of security, a former Army Ranger named Jake Morrison, "our contacts in various agencies have gone quiet. Either they don't know anything about this woman, or they've been ordered to stay silent about an ongoing operation." Callahan's criminal organization operated on the principle that information was the most valuable currency in the corruption marketplace. His network included assets in federal databases, police record systems, and even intelligence agencies, allowing him to research potential threats with resources that rivaled those of legitimate law enforcement. The fact that Margaret Walsh appeared to have materialized from thin air suggested that someone with extraordinary capabilities was protecting her identity, raising the terrifying possibility that his empire was under federal investigation. The pressure of uncertainty began to affect Callahan's judgment in ways that his subordinates found increasingly concerning. "Maybe we should postpone the competition," suggested Morrison during a strategy meeting in Callahan's private office. "If this is some kind of federal setup, we're walking into a trap by proceeding with a public event." But Callahan's ego and paranoia had merged into a dangerous combination that made retreat impossible. "If they want a fight, we'll give them one," had declared, his voice carrying the edge of a man who'd realized that his criminal empire might be entering its final phase. The transformation of Thunder Peak in the days leading up to the competition revealed the true extent of Callahan's resources and influence. What appeared to casual observers as normal event preparation was actually the deployment of a private army disguised as security contractors, maintenance workers, and technical support staff. Federal surveillance teams counted over 40 armed personnel who'd arrived at the facility with credentials that appeared legitimate but couldn't be verified through normal channels. "Callahan's not just preparing for a shooting competition," Agent Martinez observed grimly. "He's preparing for a war." The media attention surrounding the Precision Excellence Challenge had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Fueled by social media posts about the mysterious housewife who'd humiliated elite shooters with an impossible reverse grip technique, news crews from major networks requested permission to cover the event, while shooting sports enthusiasts from across the country made travel plans to witness what promised to be an unprecedented display of marksmanship skills. "This is either perfect cover for our operation or a complete disaster waiting to happen," Detective Chen remarked as she watched satellite trucks positioning themselves in the Thunder Peak parking lot. Maggie spent the final night before the competition in a secure safe house, reviewing intelligence reports and finalizing contingency plans with her federal handlers. The weight of public expectation had transformed what was originally conceived as a covert operation into a very public confrontation between legitimate law enforcement and institutional corruption. "Tomorrow isn't just about proving my shooting skills," she reflected during the final briefing. "It's about demonstrating that ordinary citizens can stand up to powerful criminals and win, even when those criminals have infiltrated the very institutions supposed to protect us." The morning of the competition dawned gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon that seemed appropriate for the confrontation that was about to unfold. As Maggie drove toward Thunder Peak, she passed through neighborhoods where many residents had no idea that their local shooting range was the headquarters of a criminal organization that had corrupted law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The disconnect between public perception and hidden reality exemplified everything that was wrong with a system that allowed corruption to flourish in darkness while presenting a facade of legitimacy to the outside world. Inside Thunder Peak, Callahan made final preparations that revealed his desperation and paranoia had reached dangerous levels. The facility's security cameras had been augmented with military-grade surveillance equipment, while strategically placed weapons caches ensured that his people could respond to any threat with overwhelming firepower. Remember, he told his inner circle during a final strategy meeting, we're not just defending our business today. We're defending our entire way of life. If we lose here, everything we've built over the past 3 decades disappears forever. The federal task force moved into position as the first competitors arrived, their agents blending seamlessly into the crowd of media personnel, event staff, and spectators who gathered to witness what had been billed as the most important shooting competition in decades. All units in position. Agent Martinez reported through encrypted communications. Target is secured and ready to proceed. Operation Thunderstrike is now active. The code name reflected both the location of the confrontation and the swift, decisive action they hoped to achieve. As Maggie walked through the entrance of Thunder Peak for what she knew would be the final time, she carried with her the hopes of every honest law enforcement officer who'd been corrupted or intimidated by Callahan's network, every athlete who'd been cheated by corrupt officials, and every ordinary citizen who'd suffered while criminals hid behind badges and authority. The simple suburban librarian was about to become a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption, proving that individual courage could still triumph over organized criminality when supported by truth and justice. The Precision Excellence Challenge was scheduled to begin at noon, but the real confrontation had already started the moment Maggie entered the building. In the hours that followed, the shooting range would become the stage for a battle that would determine whether corruption or justice would prevail in American institutions, with the outcome potentially affecting millions of citizens who had no idea that their future was being decided by a quiet woman with an extraordinary reverse grip and an unshakable commitment to doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The final stage of the competition took place in the club's most exclusive facility and underground range, designed to simulate the kind of close-quarters combat scenarios that legitimate military forces would never officially acknowledge. As competitors descended into the basement complex, Sarah noted the sophisticated surveillance equipment and soundproofing that suggested this space had hosted activities far more serious than sporting competitions. The walls displayed photographs of previous graduates who had gone on to lucrative positions with various private military companies, their faces bearing the hard expressions of people who had seen and done things that existed outside normal legal frameworks. Marcus stood at the center of the underground facility like a ringmaster presenting his greatest show, surrounded by representatives from Titanium Defense and several other contractors, whose presence confirmed the international scope of the corruption Sarah had been investigating. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing in the concrete chamber, "this final stage will separate those who truly understand the requirements of modern private security work from those who remain constrained by outdated notions of conventional military ethics." The casual dismissal of ethical constraints sent a clear message about the kind of operators these companies were seeking to recruit. The challenge itself was designed to be a final test of moral flexibility disguised as tactical evaluation. Competitors would face a series of scenarios involving hostage situations where targets were deliberately positioned to make it impossible to achieve mission objectives without accepting civilian casualties. The scoring system heavily penalized hesitation or attempts to find alternative solutions, rewarding only those who could efficiently eliminate designated targets regardless of collateral damage. Sarah watched in growing horror as the first competitors demonstrated exactly the kind of ruthless efficiency that Marcus and his clients were seeking, treating simulated civilian casualties as acceptable costs of mission completion. When Derek's turn came, he deliberately failed the evaluation by spending too much time attempting to find solutions that would minimize civilian harm, earning dismissive comments from the observing executives about his lack of operational focus. His performance was calculated to mark him as unsuitable for recruitment, while establishing him as someone who posed no threat to the organization's activities. As planned, his apparent failure created an opportunity for him to move freely among the facility's restricted areas, while security attention remained focused on the remaining competitors. Sarah's position as the final competitor in the rotation provided the perfect opportunity to implement the plan she and Derek had developed. As she prepared for her turn, she noticed Morrison positioning himself among the titanium defense representatives with a small recording device concealed in his jacket, ready to capture whatever revelations might emerge from the confrontation they had been planning for 3 years. Rebecca Torres had also managed to position her camera crew in the observation area, her journalist instincts apparently having convinced Marcus that media coverage would enhance rather than threaten his organization's reputation. Mrs. Shane, Marcus announced with obvious anticipation of watching her fail in spectacular fashion. Your turn to demonstrate whether you have what it takes to succeed in the real world of private security operations. His tone carried the condescension of someone who had never doubted the outcome of this final test, confident that the woman he'd been mocking would either fail miserably or reveal herself to be so morally compromised that she could be easily controlled through blackmail. What he couldn't have anticipated was that Sarah had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment, planning not just her tactical approach but every word she would speak when the time came to reveal the truth. As Sarah approached the firing line, she made the decision that would change everything. Instead of maintaining the conventional grip that had characterized her previous performances, she shifted to the reverse grip technique that had once made her legendary among special operations forces worldwide. The subtle change in her stance immediately caught the attention of every military veteran in the observation area, their trained eyes recognizing a signature that belonged to someone operating at an entirely different level of expertise. Her first shot shattered not just the designated target but also the carefully constructed facade that had protected Marcus's operation for years. The bullet struck with such precision that it eliminated the target while deliberately missing the civilian simulation positioned directly behind Ida's shot that required not just exceptional skill but perfect understanding of ballistics and ricochet patterns that few shooters in the world could calculate under pressure. The demonstration continued with a series of increasingly impossible shots that showcased abilities far beyond what any civilian competitor should possess, each one designed to send a clear message that the woman they had been underestimating was someone entirely different from who she claimed to be. "Stop," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic, as he finally understood that his carefully controlled environment was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "This competition is over. Security. Escort Mrs. Chen from the premises immediately." But his commands fell on deaf ears as everyone present, competitors, executives, and security personnel, alike stood transfixed by the impossible display of marksmanship they were witnessing. Sarah had transcended the realm of competition and entered something closer to performance art. Each shot a statement about the difference between true professional competence and the manufactured expertise that Marcus had been selling to his clients. "My name isn't Sarah Chen," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber as she lowered her weapon and turned to face the gathered crowd. "I'm Captain Sarah Martinez, formerly of the 5th Special Forces Group, and I've spent the past 3 years investigating the weapons procurement fraud that killed 12 members of my unit in Afghanistan." The revelation hit the assembled executives like a physical blow, their faces cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as they realized they had been trapped in an elaborate sting operation disguised as a social gathering. 3 years ago, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison was preparing to testify about systematic corruption in defense contracting when he was supposedly killed in what was ruled an accidental explosion, Sarah continued, her words carefully chosen to maximize their impact on the guilty parties present. What Marcus Blackwood and his associates didn't know was that Colonel Morrison had already shared his evidence with me, and that his death was staged to protect him while he gathered additional proof of their crimes. She gestured toward Morrison, who stepped forward from among the titanium defense representatives, removing his executive facade to reveal the military bearing that had never truly been hidden. Morrison's appearance among the corporate representatives sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, confirming that their most sensitive discussions and activities had been monitored by federal law enforcement for months. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in the commanding voice that Sarah remembered from their years serving together, "you are all witnesses to a federal investigation into conspiracy, weapons trafficking, and accessory to murder charges that will be filed against multiple individuals present in this room." His words triggered immediate chaos as executives began demanding explanations, while security personnel found themselves unsure whether they were protecting criminals or legitimate business people. Derek's voice cut through the confusion from the facility's main entrance, where he had positioned himself to prevent anyone from leaving during the confrontation. "Federal agents are already in position around the building," he announced, his military training evident in the calm authority with which he managed the tactical situation. "No one will be leaving until this investigation is complete and all evidence has been secured." His statement was confirmed by the sound of vehicles arriving outside, followed by the appearance of FBI agents in tactical gear who had been waiting for Sarah's signal to move in and secure the scene. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, reaching for a concealed weapon while shouting about unauthorized federal overreach and violation of private property rights. His movement was intercepted by Sarah's final demonstration of the skills that had made her legendary a non-lethal shot that disabled his weapon without causing permanent injury, showcasing the precision that had once saved countless lives in situations where conventional approaches would have failed. The shot served as a perfect conclusion to her performance, demonstrating that true professionals use their abilities to protect rather than exploit the vulnerable. As federal agents secured the scene and began processing evidence that would dismantle a corruption network spanning multiple countries and defense contractors, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of justice served. The reverse grip technique that had made her famous had served its final purpose, not as a tool of war, but as a symbol of accountability for those who had betrayed the principles they claimed to serve. The simple woman who had been ridiculed at the shooting range had reminded everyone that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons were truth and courage in the hands of someone willing to use them for justice rather than profit. Rebecca Torres's cameras had captured everything, ensuring that the story of corruption and accountability would reach a national audience before anyone could attempt to suppress or spin the revelations. In the weeks that followed, congressional hearings would expose the full scope of the conspiracy, leading to criminal convictions, corporate restructuring, and reforms designed to prevent similar betrayals of public trust. Sarah's decision to risk everything for the truth had not only avenged her fallen comrades, but protected countless future victims of the kind of systematic corruption that thrived in the shadows of legitimate institutions. The headlines that followed would indeed focus on her remarkable shooting skills, but those who understood the deeper story recognized that her greatest achievement was proving that individual courage could triumph over institutional corruption when supported by careful planning, loyal allies, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The elite precision shooting club would never recover from the scandal, but the principles that Sarah and her comrades had sworn to defend emerged stronger for having been tested in the crucible of real-world moral complexity.